Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're very well. I am Anton Wally. I have been involved in the Irish open source ecosystem for a long time. So a day like today is actually really, really special to see so many folks attend, see the work that Claire's been doing and the team over the last number of years, sort of come to this point and get more and more critical mass. Have folks over from different parts of the world come and contribute, as well as having some local folks in as well. So what I plan to do here is pass the mic down, everybody introduce themselves, and then I've got some thoughts about how we want to kick off the conversation, and then take it from there. Okay? So Phil.
This is my penalty for sitting at this end. So I'm Phil Weir, I'm founder and CEO of Flax and Teal. We're a Belfast headquartered company that works globally, but we are particularly working in open source solutions, creating open source and trying to apply open source in places that might not be traditionally, from cultural heritage to scientific computing.
I'm Sayeed Choudhury from Carnegie Mellon University. I have 3 roles there. I'm the Associate Dean for Infrastructure, Head of the Open Source Programs Office, and the Director for OFAI.
I'm Duane O'Brien. I lead collaborative engineering at Capital One. If you don't know Capital One, they are one of the top 10 banks in the US. I've been building, leading, advising open source programs offices kind of around the industry and out of academia and private sector now for about 10 years. Former Group Steering Committee and board member at the Open Source Collective Foundation.
Cool. Cheers. Thanks very much. Yeah, I think as we know, the title is the Global Open Source AI Opportunity. So I'm going to take a bit of a risk and assume that everybody knows what the globe is. Okay, but I want to unpack the title. I don't want to argue about whether the globe exists or not. That's a different conversation, but we know what a globe is. So there's been a lot of conversations around sort of definitions of open source and definitions of open source AI. So I don't necessarily want to get into that. I think there's been some good discussion already today. But I do want to ask the panel to just help us define what we mean by opportunity. So I've got a little bit of a sales background, so opportunity means a very, very specific thing to me, but it probably means something slightly different up and down the panel. And I think we start there, and then we work through that. So again, Phil, sorry to put you under the cosh again. How do you see opportunity then, obviously, within the context of open source and AI? What is opportunity?
That is a great question. I'm going to try and not answer it as an SME exclusively, because I think, like you mentioned, Anton, we've got I think there is an important economic point about opportunity, but I think there's also, for us, a reality about the social side, around the community interactions that can be facilitated, about the empowerment of people and communities globally that maybe would be much more dependent on the services sector that are quite expensive, and maybe there are opportunities in AI to there. However, with my SME hat back on, yes, I absolutely think there are commercial opportunities, and I think that's something that touches on some of that open source and AI discussion. And I think there was a really good point raised about the risks of maybe diluting that, where non-commercial terms come in and things like that would be. So I'd say there's a range of ways of interpreting it, but there's a lot of it.
So I'll build on something I mentioned in just the previous talk. I think the opportunity exists to build the next instantiation of digital infrastructure, whether that's the internet, the web, and now AI, and to do so in a way that learns from the previous 2 large major development efforts in that regard, take what happened well, discuss what that means, in those 2 contexts, and what didn't happen as well, maybe as intended or designed, and how that moves forward.
I'll try to, I don't know, I'm going to get a little philosophical about it. But when I think about the opportunity, I think we see a real wrestling match happening right now between private industry and control with large language models, and sort of the bigger popular ones that are contained by the hyperscalers we're talking about, and the rest of us, right? And so when I think about opportunity, I think about the moment that we have right now to get this definition of OpenAI right? And I think about, and you say in your last talk, you were talking about sort of maybe the way that DeepSeek got to where they got it because they didn't have access to chips and so on and so forth. And there's been this narrative for the last several years that it's extremely expensive to, you need a lot of chips, you need a lot of data, and the people who are saying that have a lot of data to have a lot of chips, right? And so, or they're trying to sell you a lot of data and sell you a lot of chips. So I think that there is an opportunity right now to sort of check against that narrative, both in terms of how we define the openness of AI and also how we think about how attainable these things are for the rest of us.
We have a follow-up.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, actually, I think that takes us in a really interesting direction because opportunity is a hugely subjective word, and I think you've presented it there a good example of the opportunity that chip manufacturers saw and continue to see, as well as the opportunity that both big tech and small tech see now. And in some ways, I think this is the kind of environment, and particularly open source by its nature, is a great way of bringing together different interpretations of opportunity and seeing where they can align, because that's where collaboration comes.
Let me just build on
No,
that.
We'll give it back
Yeah,
later.
I assume this is what you want. So I'll note that DeepSeek used NVIDIA chips. They just use, quote, inferior ones, right? And one of the reasons NVIDIA's market cap is infinity is because they claimed they were going to produce chips every 12 months, every 24 months, some rapid cycle that seems incredibly ambitious. So how much of this is you need to produce chips every 12 to 24 months versus you need to do that to get additional investment? So we have an opportunity to ask those questions in a very, I'd like to think, thoughtful way.
Yeah, and I think, like you mentioned, Sayeed, there was some very interesting examples that you gave around HTTP and TCP, but what's not clear to me, as someone who's been involved, as mentioned, with a few open source projects, but I'm going to reference to the likes of Node.js or say the likes of sort of Kubernetes, which are very, very successful open source projects. They had a very flexible extensibility and adoption model. You could go from zero, and we're taking Node.js for example, I'm going to write a web page, I'm writing that JavaScript, I can now move that JavaScript, and I've got a reference model to move servers and blah, blah, blah. You can see how you're walking into an adoption, and you've got that accessibility from a technology point of view. Like, where do you think AI is on that journey? And speaking as an outsider, someone who's seen how that works, but I don't necessarily know how well that works in AI at the moment. Yeah, I don't know if you want to go first or whether it's in there already.
So I'll mention my brother works in the telecom industry and has worked in the standards world his entire career. So we have lots of interesting conversations. He doesn't understand how software gets released with bugs, for example. Okay, I understand you don't build a bridge and say, maybe it's okay. I get it. But I also sit there and say, wait, how long is that standard document and how many people have to look at it? And he will tell me stories about weeks being spent on one page of it, where commas are, things like that. I think there's a happy medium between those two worlds. And one thing he said to me at several of these meetings is people often say, remember, the best standards are the ones that people use, the ones that people work with. So when developing a standard becomes the goal rather than the means, I think we've lost our way, right? And Kubernetes is, as far as I know, not a standard, right? But it is a de facto standard, right? You may not use it, and you can explain why. But if you use it, there's a decreasing number of people who say, why are you using Kubernetes, right? That was probably a perfectly valid question early on. But there are these community processes, adoption pathways, all these different kinds of mechanisms that signal to a community this is essentially becoming a de facto standard. I think that's much more probable for AI than the standard kind of standards. Does that make sense? The typical way that standards are developed.
If the question is where do I think we are sort of on that, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
I think about it being just after the mad dash, right? And whether that mad dash was a land grab while companies tried to get out and sort of stake a claim in a particular domain when it comes to AI, or whether it was businesses rushing to implement things because they thought there were upsides and tremendous cost savings. We've heard heard and read stories about companies letting go of their entire customer service department and trying to replace it with a chatbot and realizing that's a terrible idea, or heaven forbid their mental health support line in some cases and stuff like that. So we've seen the dashing. We are starting to find the limits of some of that dashing. And Doug Crockford made an observation that's really stuck with me a couple weeks ago. Doug Crockford, famously one of the creators of JavaScript, pointed out that if there were large swaths of undiscovered data that could be used to train these models, we would have already dug them up, right? So if we've hit the point where we know what the data is now and we're using it, and some of those same data sets we're kind of starting to see, so that the dash is over, now we start to get to wrestle with some of the stickier problems. You talked about learning from what we did well, right? Like, when I watch the evolution of the licenses that apply to some of the assets that come out of the AI space, we are tripping over the same rocks that we have been arguing about in the open source community for 10 or 20 years, right? We already figured that out, right? We already figured out that when you put unique usage restrictions on your license, that the community will bias in the direction of the ones that are more open and more freely available. It happens every time. But yet, we are relearning this in the AI model space, right? Every version of a new AI model comes out with, if you've been tracking Llama in particular, like every version of Llama, the license is different from the last one. They can't even be consistent from model to model. And they have each unique weird restrictions that over time we will see, because we're past the mad dash now, the community will start to converge on the more open models.
Yeah, I think there's two sides. One, I'm going to try and actually, as you guys have done, is answer your question. But I also have I think it's interesting seeing at the moment how that boundary is shifting. And I suppose maybe as a counterpoint, it does feel like some of these questions are still coming up in the source world as well. I think the point about what is open washing, one of the analogies that always comes back to me is organic solved this problem at some point 20, 30 years ago and said, yeah, but if you're going to call it organic, you've got to mean something by that has a concrete definition. And okay, fair enough, open has a very contextual meaning, and there are some people who are really going to play maximum with that in something that's a non-deterministic system for generating numbers. But it's also something that I think we do much more broadly than AI need to come to grips with, is when someone says open, what do we expect that to mean? How do we interpret that? And if it's something that ties back to the four freedoms, that becomes a hard time, not a conceptual, oh gosh, open AI, it's been open in the title and it's 4 letters, that's 2/3 open. So that's on one side. Do I think we can get there? Yeah, I think we can get there. And I think that's absolutely right. The more people are using this and doing this, the more pressure there is. Just on the standards point, because I've had, also not to go too far off track, but you can both reach this if I do. But we were, last week I was actually in an interesting discussion. I was over in London with some different service providers in particular fields. Some from California, some from around England and ourselves. And the reason was that we all work with a particular open source framework for doing knowledge management, which of course has potential applications within the AI space. And we've been providing services around this. And there's an interesting confluence, because what we realized was, well, actually, we're providing services, but we also want to have a degree of interchangeability and equivalence, because that's good for the marketplace. And what's good for the marketplace is actually good for the providers, in most cases. So we got together and we said, well, how about, and I'm not saying this is entirely providers, this is a bit of a mixed community, and said, okay, well, how do we standardize this? And most importantly, what do we standardize? Not everything. We do very focused on Kubernetes deployments that work in a specific way, but different people do different things different ways. However, everybody wants to be able to say, okay, well, if we don't work out, or you want to change the fundamental open source services, if you don't want to work with us, you can work with someone else, but that is an assumption that there is some standardization and some interchangeability of providers. So that, I think, is going to be part of the discussion. Sorry.
Any responses? Oh, yeah, I knew there would be.
Sorry, just one other point, adding to everything that you said. I think about portability issues at each of these different components, right? So there's the data portability across models, there's the code portability, the weights and so on. The one thing that seems to be a real challenge right now is that inferencing layer, right? And I think Bill, I don't know if he said it in his talk or yesterday at lunch, was saying that, you know, not much of an exaggeration. There's 5 people in the world who understand how this model works, right? And I'm told that Mark Zuckerberg writes handwritten notes to people at other companies trying to lure them away. I suspect he has lots of things, demands on his time, so he's doing that. It tells you there's a very small number of people who actually understand how these things work at that statistical layer. Right? So what does the portability mean in that case is not clear to me. I'm certainly not one of those people. So how we think about portability across all the different components, I think, will be very important.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation there. I think one of the philosophies of open source has always been around sort of many eyes make all bugs shallow. And when it comes to operating system internals, I think there's a question even at that layer. But now we're talking about sort of way specialized aspects of technology, and I think it's something we're going to have to think about. In terms of sort of opportunity, we've spoken about where we are on the adoption and that type of thing. But I know there's something. Looking at your bios, I was stalking you all last night on LinkedIn, as a good moderator should. And I think something that crossed my mind. We talk about opportunity, and you mentioned actually in your talk, and it was great to see in terms of the global south. I know it's something, Phil, me and you have spoken about there, sort of how, and it was something that was definitely a big focus for the Node project, was how do we get this technology into people's hands that would never have technology before, where they aren't just a consumer of it. And I'd love to get an opinion from all of you on that. And Duane, I know you're very focused on skills, and I think that's another aspect of the conversation as well. So again, I'll go Phil first. Keep it simple.
Yeah, I think that's for me is one of the really exciting things about not just in the AI space, but just open source in general. The opportunity to, it's not automatic by any means, but the opportunity to engage people in ways that don't tie back to some big license agreement somewhere that has to be established. And what we've been doing over the last year, that's maybe a case in point. We've got some relationships that tie back to, I don't know if anyone's from Dundalk or lives in Dundalk. I'm going to celebrate Dundalk. I used to work doing computational science and European projects there, and the contacts that I made there, some of them are now in research institutes in India. So that connection, there's work that we can do together, there's interest that we have, we do work in the geospatial space, that's a particularly interesting area in India right now, for those who are familiar. And one of the things that we started doing was saying, well actually, some of the technologies that we're using, they're open source, we've got projects and people that want to look at research questions of these. We've got students who are doing master's projects that we want to support, and the friction for trying to get someone doing a project and producing a master's was absolutely non-existent. It was really straightforward. And honestly, there's a more onto that story, I think. You know, and what we've seen them producing is fantastic. We've just set up collaborations. None of this is funded, well, not in any major way, other than what we're putting in. And ourselves, so it's not like there's some big research pop going into this. But we're able to say, okay, well actually these technologies, you can pick them up, you can use them, and now there's interest from some of the research institutes. And you know, we took, what am I supposed to say here? We took a paper from a large aeronautic company that was public and said, can we reproduce these results with this software? Yeah, we can. What can we do on top of that? Let's see what they think about it.
Real science then.
Yeah.
How dare you? Strike fear into every faculty member. So I have a maybe somewhat strange point of comparison is I think about mobile phones and how they took off in the global south for various reasons, sometimes as simple as I don't have to travel all day to the market to see if I can sell my potatoes today, right? I can get that information in advance and do other things. So there was a leapfrog effect that someone speculated about, and I think to some degree did happen as people didn't get landlines, right? But they actually got mobile phones in many places in the global south. Carnegie Mellon has a campus in Rwanda, in Kigali, and so we get first-hand information from people in Rwanda and throughout the African continent about their perceptions around AI. The early evidence is showing that a similar type of mindset exists, that there's this eagerness, enthusiasm to embrace it because it might have this big power effect. What I will also point out, though, is the people who receive those mobile phones in places like Bangladesh, when I was born, never asked what's happening with my data, and so on. So we need to be careful of saying, okay, you have this real eagerness, let's work with you to adopt it and to see the kinds of use cases or services or functions you want to provide. But we actually want to talk to you also about evaluating these systems as well, right? And one of the real, in my opinion, missing pieces right now are rigorous evaluation frameworks for these models. And this is not my area of expertise, but people at Carnegie Mellon who are experts in this will tell you that the existing engineering evaluation frameworks we have will not work. They just won't. So how we develop those new frameworks should also happen to people in the global south. They should not be developed as my own institution by people in Pittsburgh to be then deployed by people in Kigali and Rwanda, but done in partnership between those two. That's just one example. So I think we can channel that enthusiasm and eagerness that's probably there, but not only just here, go use it and do something useful for yourself, but also evaluate that and then eventually help us build it.
I want to say thank you for sitting at that end and giving me all the time. My answer before we got down here. Listen, I want to try to model a behavior here. As someone who did not grow up in the global south, has never worked in the global south, has barely been to the global south, I am not qualified to answer this question. Okay? So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about what I think the role of the state could be in this discussion. Are there folks here from the government? Don't be afraid. It's okay. Okay. No, it's nothing but love, right? I love the example Barry gave from the stage earlier today when he was talking about moving to Drupal for CMS and how many people there were in Ireland that could support the Drupal. There were 3, and by leaning into that technology, they created an entire ecosystem of Drupal contributors and people who can support Drupal here in Ireland. And I think that is the opportunity that the role that the state can play in trying to get technology and build skills in local areas, no matter where you are, right? The state is uniquely positioned to make investments that might not look immediately profitable because they have all these other fallout effects, right? So when you make it clear that these technologies are important to you, when you make it clear that you need to develop technologies, there are all these other fallout effects that will happen. And it's I think one tool that could be brought to bear sort of in the broader general sense. But if you ask me how we help get AI technologies into the hands of the global South development community, I can't answer that question. I don't know what I'm talking about.
It was just, to be fair, it was more to gather some understanding of where you see deficit around skills within your sphere of understanding. So I think it's not just about the global south or but from a, I don't want to say a Capital One perspective, but from a business perspective, like what gates are you seeing organisations have to step through? You mentioned there actually your response covered it off really, which is you really do support and government getting that community and that impetus together. I think that's one of the things that Claire's actually we're doing in the Open Island Network is trying to drive that sort of government national level conversation because I think it's recognised that it is. I think how are we for time?
We're fine with about the 12 minutes.
Grant. Okay, so I think obviously, as we opened at the start and spoke about opportunities and opportunity from a certain perspective, having a business aspect to it, but you can look at opportunity and understand it in terms of do we need diversification? What are the markets that we want to look at? Are there any, from your experience that you've been working in, are there any surprising use cases or deployments, or some things that you wouldn't have necessarily expected when you came across AI? And I won't just pick on Phil here. So anybody can put their hands up for that. Is there something that you've come across over the past 12 months that, do you know what, I didn't expect that? Or... No. 12 minutes, 11 minutes now. Come on.
I'll try to speak for 11 minutes.
Yes.
So again, I'm sorry I keep referring to the previous talk I just gave, but the conversation I had with the Pangea team, I can't even want as an example of that, where they developed a research project that is about multilingual translations. They didn't think about the amazing potential it has. You know, I thought about it in healthcare, but there's lots of places where having a safe, open, responsible, secure, unsafe, that's all embedded, AI model for translation has enormous impact, right? And I think that this is one of the challenges we face in universities is we have some of the smartest people in the world, I believe, but they don't necessarily understand the context where their work might be applied, right, and where it could be useful. And I typically assert that in most cases, an AI model may be built for a particular kind of purpose, but the killer app side of it may be unanticipated. And I think that one of the, whatever you want to call it, current understanding or observations of these large tech companies that have built these foundational models is the magic hasn't happened. I'm not saying it won't. They didn't build a model that answered every question that exists, right? And they didn't realize that not everybody wants to ask a question, that there's actually other things you might want with help. And that's why I think a lot of interest in agents, right, is that they're task-based. So I think that much like the internet, much like the web, we have a particular aspect or a purpose we're willing toward, but we won't really know the potential until many, many people build on it and participate.
I'm not going to try to build on that.
No.
I'm going to go pretty different direction. I also agree. No, I think in terms of unexpected applications that we have seen, I can maybe comment on one or two anecdotal examples now that I've had enough time to think about it. So also just echo previous statement there that, I think you're absolutely right. We don't have the knowledge or in the situations to comment on what the best thing is anywhere else in the world. I think that's absolutely true. I do think though there is an inevitability of collaboration and collaborative attitude is important, and without that we can't start having a discussion from our perspective. And I think that's been one of the things that we've learned. And one of the outcomes of that in terms of unexpected applications was that we were doing a piece of work around landslide classification, reproducing some work that had been done in Japan, I think, looking at applications of topology and machine learning within this space, and okay, that works quite well. And then someone pointed out that, well, actually, over here, somebody's doing classification of hill forts, looking at polygons in the archaeological space. Could we apply this model here and see what happens? Not necessarily say this is going to work or this is going to... But again, the fact that we've got access to the tools, the people who are doing the work, which is great, there are different countries involved here, and the fact that can just be walking past, seeing, and it literally was, walking past, seeing a poster on the wall and going, oh, what's that like? And suddenly there's a new application that's just come out of that. And that is, I think, more participatory than if someone said, here is a research call. Now another example that I'll keep short, I as a hobby, I'm doing a part-time degree in Irish, and which I'm not going to try and impress anyone with, because actually you can all speak like that now. Actually, walking on the road. However, I had a sudden idea that I quite like Dungeons and Dragons. Does anyone else do Dungeons and Dragons? Yeah, we know. Why are we not doing Critical Role on here? And I thought, what would happen if you take one of the standard prompts for AI prompts, computational AI, and say all the questions and answers in Irish? It's never going to be good. No one's saying that, and I think to the points that you were making, that's not a solution. But it worked surprisingly well. Not a great crack. So sometimes you can just find the most random things come out of a random conversation, and I think some of that access is about seeing those come to materialization before someone kills it all.
No, that I can
Sorry.
that I can build on. If I step away from like what's an amazing application that's really low around. I'm how do I say this? I'm super hyper optimistic, but I'm secretly very curmudgeonly, right? And so when ChatGPT exploded, I immediately got sort of drowned out in the hype and overblown, and that was sort of my perspective for a while. And as we watched it evolve, certainly some of the capabilities of some of these things are impressive. But where I actually really started to get impressed is when I started seeing people who were taking small, purpose-built, sort of task-oriented agents and so on and so forth, and doing more focused research into things that you could do with purpose-trained models and so on and so forth. An engineer on our team found a research paper and surfaced it up to me that was all about how to assess open source contributions more effectively using some of these more purpose-built driven models to see how closely you need to pay attention and govern those contributions. One of the things that you have to do in any company is you have to set some policy around how you're going to make open source contributions, right? And if your company holds a lot of intellectual property, you want to make sure that you don't have some intellectual property in those by accident. And historically, that has all been driven entirely by Amanda knows what all of our IP is, so I'm going to look at every contribution and say yes or no. And that's a terrible scale if you've got thousands of engineers who are trying to do things. Like, if there are purpose-built models that can be trained on that problem and look at your IP portfolio and what your contributions are, like, that stuff starts to get really interesting to me. And so, is there something about what you said when talking about purpose-built stuff that I think that gets very exciting and very interesting. I'm much more impressed by that than something that was trained on all the knowledge of the web and can follow it back up.
Yeah, okay. We're getting flagged down the bottom there, which is no problem. So I think the last one that I really had was events like these. It's fantastic to have all the members, so many members of the Irish open community in front of us. What I'd ask is, over the next, what advice would you give folks looking at OpenAI in order to, talking about building it out as a global opportunity, what advice would you give to folks within the national ecosystem, particularly the Irish one, if we want to go there? But how could we help progress what we're doing in order to have a presence on the global stage, but also try to keep and maintain the local economy as well? So any thoughts that you have just on that final note? You'll go back again.
I'll lead off.
Yeah,
I'll echo some of what I said earlier about the role the state can play in sort of building up that kind of community.
So who were the two people from the state?
There was one, two, and then a very reluctant hand over here. Might be from a secret agency. One of the things that I have seen kind of coming through the open source program office lens is companies work to understand and kind of get their heads around how do we govern the intake of models, how do we govern the intake of data sets in this environment where all this crazy license proliferation is happening out there and everyone's trying new things that we've all tried before and so on and so forth. There is a body of knowledge that already exists on how we do that for open source software that can be applied to how we govern some of the same assets from AI. There is a need for that beyond the immediate community. There's a need for that globally. There will continue to be a need for that globally. And I think the more that we can do to build on that knowledge here, the more, especially as more and more of that work shows up in Ireland, the more that you make those skills available not just for your local economy, but for the global.
I'm going to borrow a comment from earlier this morning. Maybe because the last 3 weeks in the US have been very interesting. Someone said, I forget who it was, maybe Dermot said, you know, we need to celebrate what is uniquely Irish, about our history, our culture, our music, our language, but then integrate it into the way things work, open source, innovation, and so on. I will just double down on that in a big way. If you look at the web and Wikipedia, we didn't get it right, quite frankly, right? We have disproportionate amount of voices or perspectives in that content. We have a long way to go to get there with training data for AI, but we have another chance. We have another opportunity. I mentioned CMU Africa. I went to a summit there, and somebody presented an African language, like a large language model that has been developed. And she said, this is an opportunity for us to expose people to these languages that nobody knows, that most people outside of Africa have never heard. So the more we have that, the better. And certainly, Ireland is one place that's reading that too.
I'm going to give 2 brief examples where we've seen, now that I had an opportunity to think, this is great. Yeah. 2 examples that we've seen recently. One challenging one, so I'm going to take this from how can we do R&D, which in many cases, in our cases, involves AI, and how that can and cannot be facilitated from a public sector level. And one challenging one, a large European framework will not be named, where we found that work packages would be batch funded, but that reimbursal would be on arrears for the entire work package for 36 months. Now, I don't know how many of you have tried to run an SME without having any money in for 36 months. But I think there's sometimes that's a type of joined up thinking where you want to focus on the AI and you want to focus on the research, you can get distracted by the administration. On the positive side, I don't know if there's anybody here. I'm sure there's a few who've interacted or worked with Innovate UK.
We're getting close now.
Sorry.
No,
Okay.
no problem, finish what you're going to say.
I'll keep it brief, I swear.
Sorry, Phil, I didn't just pick up here.
No, not at all. So we participated in a couple of their programs for global collaboration, and I would recommend, I would love to see some of that happening within Irish frameworks. There's global research programs, happy to chat to anyone about how that's worked, but it actually brings people together physically in different places around the world, right around the world, not just between European countries, and gets them to sit down and understand what both groups in the room are bringing to the table in R&D, not in sales.
Thank you very much.